Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the Homework Starts with Home RFP information session. We have a lot of content that we want to cover and share, but also want to make sure that at the end of the session you'll have a chance to ask questions. So for those of you joining online, we have folks that are here in the room as well as a number of people joining remotely. And so let's just go over a few kind of housekeeping issues. My name is Eric Rumdahl. I'm with the Office to Prevent End Homelessness and the Interagency Council on Homelessness and the Department of Education. I'm joined today by a number of colleagues who I'll let introduce themselves when they begin speaking from Minnesota Housing, Dan Elias and Nancy Urbanski. So this is a really interesting initiative, Homework Starts with Home. It's a partnership of a number of state agencies. The funding for Homework Starts with Home is provided by Minnesota Housing, and really as part of Minnesota Housing's commitment to kind of recognizing how fundamental housing is for all aspects of life. So the specific focus on student homelessness that's part of this initiative is also done in partnership with the Department of Education, the Department of Human Services, and was initiated also in partnership with the Heading Home Minnesota Funders Collaborative. So a very collaborative effort that created Homework Starts with Home, and as you'll see, that'll be a theme that'll continue on through the design of the program. There we go. So we're going to just provide a very quick overview of Homework Starts with Home so that you get a chance to understand a little bit more about the program, and then go into more detail about the grant applications for both the program grants and the planning grants, before then turning to the scoring criteria and the application process, and again giving you time at the end to ask any questions you might have. We thought it might be helpful just to put today's RFP info session and this RFP in the broader context of work on student homelessness that's been part of the focus of the Interagency Council and its member agencies, including Minnesota Housing. Back in 2013, MDE and Minnesota Housing collaborated to propose a program with the long name, the Rental Assistance Pilot for Homeless and Highly Mobile Families with School-Aged Children, which ever since that name was offered, we've talked about it as the Homeless and Highly Mobile Pilot. That program operated in 3 sites, starting in 2014 and running through 2018. Homework Starts with Home was proposed in 2017, and initial funding for Homework Starts with Home was first on the ground starting in November of last year. And so that's 5 grantees, $4.15 million, 3 different sources. So Housing Trust Fund, FHPAP, and some funding from our philanthropic partners. And so that's all history. Today, where we find ourselves is with the second round of funding for Homework Starts with Home, which will be at least $3.5 million. We don't know, of course, how many grantees. There are 2 sources that are on the table for this RFP, and those include Housing Trust Fund and the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program. There are some important differences between this round of funding and the previous one that I'll cover in a minute. One of those is that also during this round, we are doing the first ever Homework Starts with Home planning grants, offering interested organizations and communities a chance to spend a year with some funding to support planning that would prepare for a subsequent application for Homework Starts with Home program grants. We do anticipate that round 3 of Homework Starts with Home funding would be available immediately following the completion of those planning grants. And so that's a kind of important piece of context as you think about which track you might be interested in. So lots of changes compared to the previous round of Homework Starts with Home funding, one of which includes the fact that there is much greater flexibility for applicants in proposing which types of funding they seek from the 2 sources that are available. In the first round of Homework Starts with Home funding, we had dedicated amounts in each of those funding sources, which meant that we could only allocate up to that total amount that was available. In this round, we have $3.5 million, but the line between each source is flexible, allowing us to actually tailor the grant awards that grantees receive based on the budgets that applicants propose. And so that can really span any amount of those 2 sources, as long as we can balance them across all applicants. The next point is that we're also providing a lot more guidance about what we actually mean in terms of implementation of the preliminary practice model for the program. We know from the first round of applicants that that practice model is a stretch for almost every community in Minnesota to fully achieve. So what we have tried to do in this application is actually provide more specific guidance and actual checklist that helps you assess your progress toward fully implementing the 7 components of that practice model. We already talked about the planning grants, but again, to emphasize that our goal here is to create a very low threshold for organizations that may not be able today to compete for a full Homework Starts with Home grant, but would be interested in doing so in the future, and to be able to encourage a lot more communities to consider applying under that practice planning grant approach. And then the last thing is we heard loud and clear that additional time for local planning to submit a competitive application would be helpful. And so I'm delighted to say that we've now extended the timeline for you to prepare your applications. They're due on March 2nd. So that's a much longer period of time than we had in the previous round.
Eric, for the funding part, can I just mention too that in the Homework Starts with Home 1 round, we did have a set amount of dollars that was awarded by the legislature, but we were able to increase that dollar amount. And so similarly, we have $3.5 million awarded by the legislature. The potential is there that that funding amount could be larger once we go to awards. I wish I could tell you an amount, but I just want to signal that to you as you're writing your application to kind of be aware of that.
Yep, so the at least $3.5 million, the at least in that is deliberate. And so just do encourage you to really think about what you want to request based on what Diane shared. So context, the motivation for the state government to propose this funding and this initiative is the fact that student homelessness is a much broader and more pervasive and more complicated, I think, challenge for us to solve than many Minnesotans may realize today. So the fact that on October 1st of 2018, which is the most recent published data we have for the statewide enrollment census, there were over 8,000 students identified, spanning almost every Minnesota county, over 1,300 schools, over 300 school districts. That fact remains one that I don't think many Minnesotans fully appreciate. It also, I think, motivates a lot of the features that you'll see in Homework Starts with Home's program design, recognizing that really the response to that challenge really has to be something that is integrative across a number of different community partners and the resources that they can offer, and really systemic at a community level in terms of facing that challenge. We also know that there are huge equity issues that are at the center of homelessness in general and student homelessness in particular. And so students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQ students are vastly overrepresented among the student homeless population. And so not only does that drive the kinds of responses that need to be offered to solve student homelessness, but we hope it's a really critical part of the applications that we receive as programs think about how to attend to those disparities and create equity. The program is focused on serving both students who are part of families, and so entire families that include at least one eligible student who's enrolled or eligible for a pre-K through grade 12 academic program. Often that family may, of course, include kids that are outside of that age range, so it's the entire family, a kind of whole family approach. But we also are focused on students that are experiencing homelessness by themselves, or at least without their parent or guardian. They themselves may, of course, have children of their own. And so both of those overlapping populations are the focus for this program. We are operating the program on the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness. And so what that boils down to is that a student may be considered homeless if their housing situation is not fixed, regular, or adequate. And so it's deliberately a broad definition. One of the benefits of that broad definition is that students that are deemed not to have all three of those ingredients or missing any one of them are eligible for a variety of supports provided by their schools to ensure that they can achieve school stability, even in the midst of housing instability. We also think that this broader catchment really does help us understand the magnitude and scope of student homelessness in our state. There is another group of individuals that are eligible for the program. Those are those that are at risk. And on this slide and in the RFP materials, there are the specific definitions of what we mean by at risk. So it's both an income test in terms of income being at or below 200% of federal poverty, as well as either living in some kind of substandard or overcrowded housing, living with somebody who engages in domestic violence or fleeing domestic violence, paying more than 50% of your income toward housing, or otherwise in some kind of a situation that documents a very imminent form of homelessness. So this is an even broader universe of potentially eligible individuals. As you'll see in the RFP instructions, the expectation is for applicants to work with their local continuum of care to determine the interface with your coordinated entry systems and how individuals would be prioritized within this definition. That's part of what you need to describe as you're preparing your application. So again, our focus on the program is really around creating systemic and kind of collaborative responses to student homelessness. How we know we get there is that we're actually able to, sorry, I moved it forward here, not there, that we are able to actually see improvements in the number of students that are prevented from experiencing homelessness, those that are experiencing homelessness, that number going down, homelessness itself becoming a more brief experience for individuals, and people leaving homelessness with housing and the supports necessary to make sure that it's stable so that homelessness does not recur. There are also really important academic and school-based measures of our success that we're after, including increases in student attendance and other measures of academic achievement. And so one way to depict those measures is that we want to prevent homelessness, shrinking the number of new incidents of homelessness. We want to make homelessness rare by increasing the number of housing outcomes for those experiencing homelessness. We want to make the experience of homelessness itself brief, and we want to make sure that folks don't cycle back into homelessness, but instead have the support they need to remain stably housed. So again, let's see. Again, there are these two tracks that are parallel in this application process. One are for program grants. That's funding that can be used to actually operate a Homework Starts with Home program. Again, to Diane's point earlier, additional funding may be available for those program grants. We cannot exceed the amount that you request in the awards that we make. I'm going to say that again. We cannot exceed the amount that you request in the awards that we make. So whatever amount of money we have available, the total amount that we could possibly give out is the sum of the requests that we receive. We cannot exceed the amount that you request. There are important geographic considerations, which we'll go into shortly, that differ between funding that is deployed in the metro area, that's the 7-county Twin Cities metro, versus the rest of the state. And again, the funding for the program grants is a combination of Housing Trust Fund, often abbreviated HTF in the application, and the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, often abbreviated FHPAP. For the planning grants, we have allocated up to $300,000 for those planning grants. The exact amount will depend in part on what we receive. Any specific grant can be up to $40,000. The purposes, as we'll get into later, are fairly flexible to support the kind of planning that would position an applicant to subsequently apply for program funding.
Can I explain that a little bit more, the 300,000 and the 40,000?
Yes, go ahead, please.
So you said there's up to $300,000 total, and an individual organization can apply up to 40,000?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, so the max award for the planning grants for any individual applicant is $40,000.
Got it, okay, thank you.
So I'll just talk for a moment about the program grants before handing this off to my colleagues at Minnesota Housing. The first piece is really to emphasize a point that I think you've probably heard me say 3 or 4 times already, how central collaboration is to the vision of Homework Starts with Home. So what we know is that often right now a family experiencing homelessness has to run a lot of errands and shuttle between different programs in order to piece together the support that they need to really have their family succeed. And that includes housing programs and mainstream economic assistance or other mainstream programs, programs that might be offered through their school. And what we are really seeking is a pretty significant sea change in the way that communities organize those resources, really centering them around the family so that it's actually kind of coordination among those different resources. And again, we've identified those same three big buckets here of housing programs and mainstream programs and school programs, but there could be other resources that you could imagine being part of this mix, and that those are really communicating with each other in a way that actually creates a response that feels like it centers the family and really smooths the path for that family to get access to what they need. There are a number of roles for the program applications that are required and pretty significant. The first is the lead applicant role, and there are some important distinctions here that we'll cover in a minute in terms of who's eligible to serve in the lead applicant role. The basic idea is that it has to be either a current FHPAP or Housing Trust Fund administrator. So if you can kind of distill your local community down to who are the current FHPAP or Housing Trust Fund grantees, that's a good starting point for you to sort out who could serve in that lead applicant role. The participating schools are those that have agreed to play a formal role in the partnership, and they can be public or charter schools or schools that have agreed to meet the public school requirements of the McKinney-Vento Act. Those requirements currently do apply to public and charter schools. They don't apply to other schools, and so if other schools are part of your application, they would have to agree to meet those public school requirements of the McKinney-Vento Act. You must have a participating local government entity. That's an organization whose primary responsibility is to deliver mainstream programs for a variety of individuals who may or may not be homeless, right? That's really the way that we think about the difference between a targeted homeless program and a mainstream program. The mainstream programs may not focus specifically or exclusively on individuals experiencing homelessness. Terry?
So can one agency be the lead applicant and the local government entity?
What a lovely question. Yes, indeed.
Okay.
An agency can play multiple of these roles.
Okay.
You have to have these first three roles covered. The additional roles are optional, but maybe end up being required based on how you configure your partnership. You have to have a current Housing Trust Fund administrator, and you have to have an FHPAP grantee if you're requesting those funds. And in the Twin Cities metro area, only counties are eligible to serve in that FHPAP grantee role. The last piece that we wanted to call out on these roles page is to really think about how central housing acquisition is for most of the participants that you're going to serve. And so being able to identify landlords or property owners or landlord associations or other groups that can help to bring that access to affordable and safe, decent housing to the table as part of the program as well. And so, Terry, to your point, your question a minute ago, you are likely to require multiple organizations working together in a formal way to be able to satisfy those required roles. It is possible that a government entity can play multiple roles depending on their scope and responsibilities, and a single entity can play multiple roles if they're eligible to do so. Again, we are not suggesting that list that you just saw is exhaustive. That's really the bare bones for what's eligible to apply for a program grant. You may identify other critical partners that you want to have as part of the equation as well. And so with that, Nancy, I'll hand that off to you, and maybe you can introduce yourself as well.
Yes, good morning, everybody. This is Nancy Urbanski of Minnesota Housing, and I'm going to be reviewing eligible applicants and eligible expenses and ineligible expenses, and also eligible recipients of both FHPAP and HTF. So I'll start with FHPAP. And eligible applicants include tribal nations, metro counties. Only in the metro, it does have to be a county. And then in greater Minnesota, it can be a county, a group of counties, or a nonprofit. And in those cases, they would need to get a board resolution from each county in their service area. There are only a few criteria for FHPAP recipients. And this is intentional because we want the program to be as low barrier as possible to access assistance. Households must be at or below 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. They must be a Minnesota resident or otherwise approved by our staff, and they must also be experiencing a housing crisis. If they're experiencing a housing crisis, they must also demonstrate that they're in need of the assistance, meaning that they don't have the means to resolve the issue themselves. You may notice, for those of you familiar with FHPAP, that our definition of a Minnesota resident has changed slightly. Our working definition used to be living or working in Minnesota. However, for this grant period, we'll need to approve any household that is not a Minnesota resident. So before you provide assistance to any household in that category, we ask that you reach out to us to verify that they would qualify. There are 3 categories of assistance that are allowable under FHPAP. They include direct assistance, admin, and support services. Direct assistance includes rental deposit, rental payment, including application fees. It also can include utility arrears and utility deposits, transportation, housing expenses, or housing inspection costs, and any other costs associated with the housing stability outcome. For support services, you see a broad list in front of you, so I won't review all of them, but essentially it covers staffing for housing navigation, case management. It can include a school staff for the time that they are committed to working in the program, and then also expenses that are tied to the support services staff, including mileage, travel, office expenses, and also equipment expenses. For equipment expenses, if you have a 0.5 staff in this program, we would expect that the equipment expenses that are tied to that staff would also be 50% of the total cost. Eligible expenses for admin include offering stipends for persons with lived experience, training, technical assistance, communications, marketing, supplies, etc. Ineligible expenses are defined by our statute, and you can see them. I'm sure you're very familiar with them, but acquiring, rehabilitating, constructing emergency shelter, payment for operating costs of shelters, and payment for emergency housing, including hotel and motel vouchers. To be eligible for housing trust fund funding, you do need to be a current HPF administrator in good standing with Minnesota Housing, and there is a link that's provided on this page that will take you to the list of current administrators.
And I would just add that if you don't have a housing trust fund administrator in your area or in the geographic area that you're serving, you can also contact us and we can try to work with you on how you would go about being able to set up rent assistance if you don't have a provider in your area.
And eligible housing trust fund recipients include persons or families whose income at the time of the initial occupancy does not exceed program limits established by the HTF administrator and are approved by Minnesota Housing. A household's income cannot exceed 60% of the median income. Housing trust fund eligible expenses include temporary rental assistance, rapid rehousing rental assistance, deposits, rental application fees, and utility connection fees. There is a fixed cost administrative fee per subsidy that's administered every month, and that is capped at $60.
Okay. So the program grant application we're going to walk through first, and then after that we'll walk through the planning grant application. So you'll hear most of what you need to know if you're applying for funds for actually implementing the program in this section. And then after that we'll get into the folks that are going to be applying for that planning grant. There are several sections of the grant application, everything from community need all the way to program design, and then also a couple of added categories that you wouldn't have seen if you were applying in a prior grant period. And one in particular that I want to call out is the special impact bonus. I'll be talking about that a little bit more, but that was in addition to this funding cycle, and it's for emphasizing projects that are able to really significantly reduce the unsheltered population or be able to actually strive to end family or youth homelessness. We realize this is a large ask on the part of our grant, but we think that it's possible that some communities are reaching that opportunity, and so we wanted to make sure that we recognize that in this application. So for community need, we really need applicants to look at which or how many households they have in their school districts that are homeless. And there is some information in the instructions that'll lead you to where that data is located at Minnesota Department of Education. So you'll have easy access to the number of students who are homeless. We advise you to think about what your geographic area will be and which schools will be included. It's possible that if you don't see some significant student homelessness in one school, you might see it in another, and you could pair those together. And just be thinking about what that looks like with your school districts and with your partners that are participating, making sure that those administrators are on board. So you might have like one school in one school district and 3 or 4 in another, and you just want to make sure that you have those partnerships and connections made to those schools so that everybody's in the know and participating with the program. And then your application will also be looking at other data sources that your community may use in order to determine whether or not your homeless need matches the resources that you're intending to use, and whether you're seeing a significant homeless rate with families versus youth, you know, or how that looks in your community. And we anticipate that in addition to just identifying the homeless students, that you'll also have some relevant data that kind of provides the context for your community. Every community looks very different from another, and the applications should reflect what your community looks like, but also what your project design is going to be. So if you have, for example, a number of vacant units, you might want to talk about that. If you have very few vacant units, you might want to talk about what that looks like and how, and then your project design might have to figure out what's the strategy to make sure that you have enough units available based on the number of households that you intend to serve. So just be thinking about how your community need that's described in that section matches later the project that you design. Eric mentioned quite a bit about collaboration and the partners. I think one of the things that is really key is to make sure that the partners that you're working with have notified and engaged their leadership in the process, especially the boards or the directors or the superintendents of the schools, so that when you actually implement or start to implement your program, you have full support of the organizations that you're working with. That's a really important piece that we found can delay implementation of a program. So if you're working with just the school liaison, but the school liaison hasn't informed the superintendent, you might not have the support of being able to connect with the schools and share information that you think you have. So just making sure to build those partnerships as you're applying for these grant funds. And then, and then just thinking about in your application also, as you define each one of the roles that your partners will play, what are they also sort of bringing to the table? Are they bringing leveraged funds? Will they be doing something special with their county mainstream resources, for example, that will make sure that they can match those to the Homework Starts with Home resources? An example I can think of would be the Housing Redevelopment Authority that's administering your rental assistance has decided that they will prioritize their Section 8 vouchers for those households if they end up needing a more permanent subsidy. So that would be an example of like a role that could be played by your Housing Trust Fund Administrator that also signals to us that there's some leveraged resources in there as well. And then, as mentioned, in your project design, you'll be sort of looking to your community need to drive whatever your design process is going to look like, and think about those outcomes that are going to be achieved when you're looking to design the program. It's like, try to walk through what's the process for somebody who gets into the program. How do they get in? How do you get those referrals? What happens once they've been referred? What process does that household go through? How do those connections to your partners get made, so that you can sort of see, especially from the reviewer side, here's what would happen as a household walks through this program and then receives the services and assistance that are needed to achieve housing. And so we'd like to see a picture of what that looks like and all of those partners and how they're going to intersect with that household along the way. And then in thinking about the outcomes piece related to that, it should tie to those outcomes in some way to show where you're expecting that folks will end up in stable housing, where you'll start to see that their attendance will be stabilizing and the support services around that, and how that actually plays out so that you can see the direct link between those activities in your project design and the outcomes that will ultimately be achieved. So we tried really hard to make sure that you understand the importance that equity is playing in our application. Some of that has to do with the points that you'll see related to the equity section. We also expect that it will be woven in throughout the application. So in your community needs section, you'll maybe identify as well the populations who are disparately impacted. You'll be able to describe what kind of strategies you're going to use in order to address the needs of those populations so that you can achieve equitable outcomes for all populations that are receiving the services. In particular, we have put into the application process a note about some of the disparately impacted populations we're seeing across the state of Minnesota that include African Americans, Native Americans, LGBTQ, and youth. And so it's not an exhaustive list. Your community may look different and may have specific populations that you also see a disparity with. And if you're looking to try to find some of that information on who is disparately impacted, you can certainly look at the Wilder Homeless Survey information. You can also check with your Continuum of Care coordinator. The Continuum of Care coordinator in your region is likely to have some additional need information. And then also your Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program has an advisory committee. There are 20 of them across the state, and they are also required to conduct assessment for part of their application process. So there's certainly a plethora of information out there that you can access to demonstrate need, and then to think about in your application, especially when you get to equity, you know, how are your services and assistance going to be different or look different or operate in order to address the disparity. So for preliminary practice model, this Eric had mentioned already. And the model was designed by state staff and members of the Home Funders Collaborative, and it was driven by feedback from stakeholders about program components were that they felt made a difference when assisting homeless and at-risk households. And it also, to some extent, was driven by maybe what was missing. So just being able to include, like, here's what we think makes the difference when a household is successfully housed. The model includes components that were being utilized by some providers, and then, of course, the ones that were missing. And for this year, we want you to give us a straightforward assessment of which components your organization has already implemented. There's no points given for that self-assessment, and that's partially because we really want people to be very honest and straightforward about where they're at with each component of the model. And then there will be up to 5 points for the second question in the section. It asks you to name one component you'll work on for the next biennium, but it also asks you to give kind of a broad assessment of how you'll be working to fully implement that entire model. One component in particular should have a work plan and detail and a timeline and people responsible. And I think that piece is really key, that we want to see at least one detailed work plan for one of the components, but we also want to know how you plan on implementing the entire model, especially the components that might be not fully implemented in your organization or your partnership. So we don't expect you to have the whole thing in place, and I think that's the greatest message. We do like to see where you're at and then how you might work toward that model becoming fully implemented. And I think if you, the more sort of honest and straightforward you are, I think the better that the application scores. I'll just be completely transparent there. It seemed, especially because we have community reviewers that will be looking at applications, that really came through on prior applications as well. So I just would encourage you to be very thoughtful about that process and how you can work toward implementing the model in the future. There are several webinars that were created for Homework Starts with Home Round 1. And they're listed here. They are available. There'll be a link on our website. There's also a link in the RFP instructions. So if you're unfamiliar with some of the components that are part of the preliminary practice model, there's some great opportunities here to be able to learn about each one of those. And I strongly encourage people to watch them if you haven't, and especially if possible, watch them with your partners, because everybody will be trying to implement this model as part of the Homework Starts with Home program. Okay, so the application will also ask you about administrative capacity for both the Housing Trust Fund and FHPAP. While it is possible that you could request funds under one category or another, depending on what type of other resources you have available, most applications will come in the door with both funding sources. And so we do need to see that for those that are applying for Housing Trust Fund dollars, that the administrator of those funds has the capacity, they have some prior experience, administering rental subsidies, they understand how to develop those relationships with landlords so that they can find the housing or help find the housing to rent, and also being able to do some of the basics of the program that are required, like the housing inspections. And so units do have to pass a housing quality standards inspection under the Housing Trust Fund program, so you definitely need somebody who knows how to administer that part of the process as well. And then for FHPAP, having experience administering the FHPAP funds will be essential. There is also an opportunity for folks under FHPAP to provide support services. And again, because those budgets aren't limited this time, it really allows you some flexibility to be able to put support services in place that might not have been as readily available in prior funding rounds. And the FHPAP programs certainly know how to conduct those support services. And so even connecting with those grant administrators to figure out how that works with rent subsidy is really useful. FHPAP grant administrators also can have subgrantees. And so some FHPAP grant administrators have a number of subgrantees and have done that over a period of time for a long time, and other FHPAP administrators have not had subgrantees before. And so if your grant process is going to include the possibility of having a subgrantee, just make sure that you're working with that FHPAP grant administrator on how that would work and their ability to manage the fiscal responsibility of that and so on. And then even the oversight and management, because they'll be responsible to do some monitoring of those subgrantees as well. So that's a really important kind of relationship that they would have to have. And then the special impact bonus, we want to make sure that this application has an additional 5 points in addition to the 100 total. And the 5 points is for priority that is given to applicants who can accomplish either ending homelessness for youth and families, and there are some links to the usage website related to what that looks like in order to accomplish an end. Your continuum of care coordinators are focused on these goals very heavily, as well as our state plan to prevent and end homelessness. And so certainly working with your COC coordinator or your local partners that are working on the Heading Home plans will help, because they'll know where you're at on how close you are to ending homelessness for one of these populations. In addition, the second bullet is to significantly reduce the number of unsheltered youth and family households in your region. We are expecting a significant impact, not just, yes, we plan to end a few people, or we have a few households that that will end, or even a small number of households, we really expect that it's a great proportion that you'll be impacting for that unsheltered count. And you can get that information from your point in time count also that the COC coordinator would have access to. You can also get some information from Wilder's homeless survey as well. And there's a description that'll ask you about how you plan to accomplish it. And I think in order to accomplish those goals, that's really where your partnership is going to come into place, and you'll be able to say, these are the things that we're going to do or that we're already working on. And you're sort of leveraging potentially some things that are already underway with your continuum of care or your region in order to address the unsheltered or ending homelessness for that population.
I'll briefly review the budget. There are pretty detailed and straightforward instructions on the first tab. And on that first tab, the only thing that you need to enter is the lead primary contact person and their information, and then also your partner organization. There's room for up to 5. If you do exceed 5 partners, then please reach out to me and we can modify the budget. We base that off of historically our past Homework Starts with Home budget, so we're thinking that will work, but if it doesn't, just definitely reach out to me. On the second tab, we really, in this area, need you to enter projected household information in essentially 3 categories. The first, the top of that tab, is total households that you're projecting to serve over the 3 years, regardless of the funding source. And then in the second line of that budget, it includes how many carryover households you anticipate having from year 1 that carry over into year 2, and then also the same for year 3. And then further down on that tab, we'll ask you to project your households based on the funding source, which breaks it down between HTF and FHPAP. And the last part of the third and subsequent tabs is entering your budget information. And again, there's room for up to 5 providers. So if you need additional providers, let me know. And also, if you do have any questions or if you run into any kinks with this, feel free to reach out to me or Meredith, and we can troubleshoot that for you. I do want to say, I'm sorry, just one more thing that I thought of. I really encourage you when you're developing your budgets to put yourself in the place of a reviewer who may not be familiar with your organization and with your expenses. And so sometimes people may be wondering, what is this line item? I don't understand it. Why is this salary so much higher than other providers? And so explain as much as you can in that narrative that's provided on the application. And then there's also under FHPAP, there's 3 other line items, 1 each for administration, direct assistance, and support services. And so please be really specific into as far as what those other items are.
All right, so now we're going to change gears and talk about the planning grants. And so just to kind of contrast with the program grants, Homework Starts with Homes planning grants are eligible applicants include many of the partners that you would actually have as part of a program grant. And that's intentional, of course, because we would imagine that the folks that are applying for a planning grant might indeed be the anchor organization or a critical partner in a subsequent application for a program grant. So nonprofits, schools, local, county, and tribal governments, housing agencies, and philanthropic organizations. The activities that planning grants can include span personnel costs, so actually covering staff time to convene people or do analysis or develop plans or whatever kind of other activities those staff would be involved in. Other kinds of planning costs like workshops or hiring consultants or getting some TA. If you have a planning cost that you're unsure whether it would be eligible, that's a great moment to reach out to Minnesota Housing to say, hey, we're thinking about proposing X for a planning cost. Would that work okay? And then lastly, administrative costs that are related to your planning can also be included in your budget. So accounting, IT, HR, materials, supplies, communications, or marketing. The application for planning grants, as I mentioned earlier, is quite a bit less intensive than the program grants, but there's still enough detail that we're able, as the reviewers, to determine is this the best use of those limited planning dollars? And so we really do need to understand your project design, how you're anticipating collaboration will be woven into your planning activities, the way that you're centering equity, the connection between your planning work and the practice model, the outcomes, and of course your budget. And so we'll talk about those. So the project design, we want to make sure that we really understand very clearly how, if funded, the planning activities you propose will in fact position your community or your organization and its partners to apply and compete competitively for a future program grant. So if you have an activity that you want to do, but it doesn't connect to subsequently applying for a planning grant, program grant, this is not the right funding opportunity for that activity. Maybe a wonderful and worthy activity, but we really do need to draw the line between the planning activities you're doing and subsequently going after program funds. We want to make sure that you really are being specific about what tasks you're going to accomplish and that the timeline feels reasonable and that the roles and responsibilities are clear and appropriate. For the collaborative aspect of it, again, we understand that for many parts of our state, the collaborations that we're envisioning for program grants don't presently exist. School partners and local government and nonprofits and other organizations may not routinely connect with each other around solving student homelessness. So a critical outcome for these planning grants can be to actually forge those partnerships if they don't exist, or if they do exist, to strengthen them and really direct them toward success down the road with a program grant. Again, given the humongous disparities in which students in Minnesota experience homelessness, the planning activities need to attend to those disparities and really help us understand how meeting the needs of students that are disproportionately impacted by homelessness is a critical part of what you will do through your planning. We don't, because this is a planning grant, we don't expect that you're implementing the practice model, but we do want to understand how your collaboration that's proposing to spend some time planning together is aligned with that practice model, and the ways in which your planning activities will again strengthen your implementation of that practice model when you subsequently solicit program funds. So, so again, it is still a Homework Starts with Home grant, even though the focus is really on planning rather than operating a program. In terms of outcomes, we want to make sure that you've been clear in assessing your readiness to go after a program grant, and to help us see, wow, if this planning grant were awarded, we would imagine that this group of partners would make a significant leap toward being competitive on a subsequent application. And of course, we're happy to see other benefit to your community and your local partnerships and to students experiencing homelessness from those planning activities. But again, the central piece is around readiness to subsequently apply. The budget is much more straightforward on the planning grant side than on the program grant side. And really what we're looking for is that you're proposing ways to use funding that are clear, that feel appropriate for the outcomes that you're after, that you've given us enough detail that we're not scratching our heads when we're reviewing the information to determine why those things were proposed, and that they're eligible for the planning grant application. And so again, if you have any questions about an activity that's not explicitly listed on the slide a couple of slides ago, please do reach out to us. We're happy to consult with you on specific things that you might consider for a planning grant. With that, I'm going to hand this back off to Diane.
This is Diane Elias. I forgot to introduce myself when I went into my section before. So the review criteria and scoring is the next section, and I want to tell you that I'm going to go through the next couple of sections really quickly, and part of that is because I want to leave enough time for questions, but also we've outlined a lot of this detail in your RFP instructions, and you're obviously welcome to contact us with any questions. We just want to make you aware that the first step in the process after we receive applications is that your application actually gets through what we call the threshold criteria. So even before your application can be reviewed, we need to make sure that you've submitted to us everything that we need, and also in the format that it needs to be submitted in. And so it does include, you know, the application, which is filled out with every section completed. The application signature page is there. You've completed the budget form. You've submitted financial information, which is detailed in the instructions. You've gotten your affirmative action certification. And with the financial information and affirmative action certification, there is more detail in the instructions, and I would follow that very closely. If you've not submitted to us before and you have any questions, feel free to call us, ask us whether or not you think, you know, you've gotten it all together, because there are a couple of steps in some of these processes. So even though it looks like one thing, you might have multiple steps in order to submit. And then an unexecuted draft of the Memorandum of Understanding between your collaboratives. This is a great opportunity for you to get that Memorandum of Understanding about all the roles the partners are going to play out to everybody for review. Some of the Memorandum of Understandings in the last round took a long time to go through legal review process, especially if they were going to be signed by school boards or administrators or counties. And so, you know, this is your chance to kind of do some of that pre-work so that you're ready to have an executed MOU at the time that you receive the award. So we do expect that draft. And then looking at your local payment standards if you're applying for housing trust fund dollars, and also a qualification form if you're a rent administrator. For the planning grant, it's much simpler. You're just looking for submitting some of that application material forms, and then also the financial information. The financial information is probably the trickiest of all of those. The others will be really, really self-explanatory, but if you have any questions about that, just let us know. So for the financial information, anyone applying for over $25,000, which is probably going to be every application, will need to give us the proper documentation for what counts as financial information. So the list is here. If you have any questions on whether or not what you're submitting matches what we're looking for, again, just feel free to submit that to us, and we can let you know if it meets our requirements. So here's your chance. If you want to make sure that you're going to meet the threshold criteria before submitting your entire application and then finding out that you've missed something, you can submit your materials before February 14th. And we can check to see if your documents meet the threshold criteria. We can also check part of your documents. So if you think, I got this signature page down, no problem, I know I'll be able to submit that and I know what it is, but you're really concerned about the financial information, you can submit the financial information and just let us know. I'm not submitting everything. I just want you to check these things that I'm submitting to make sure that they meet the threshold criteria. We will let you know if they do, and then we'll contact you with any items that are missing. We're not going to tell you anything about, we're not going to review your application or look at narrative or that kind of thing. We're only going to tell you whether you've met the threshold criteria. So the scoring has, I kind of laid it out actually when I did the presentation of the program grant application. Those bullets that were in those slides were really all about where the application gets scored and what's important to include in each section. And that's also listed in the instructions, so you'll be able to see that in great detail. I just wanted to give you a really quick highlight of the overall scoring of the grant so that you can see that different sections are weighted differently. And if you're going to be spending time to get the bulk of the points, you'll want to focus on those sections that have the greatest number of points possible. And if you think you got them all and that the round will be really competitive, you'll also want to focus on that special impact bonus because that could put you over the top. With the planning grant scoring, the weights are a little bit more similar in 4 of the sections. Project design, collaboration, equity, and outcomes become kind of the key, more weighted areas. But really, we'll be looking at the whole entire grant application. That one's worth 100 points. And just kind of thinking about most of those sections are weighted pretty equally, but just to spend the time, the bulk of your time on the sections at a greater point. Okay, so for application submission, Minnesota Housing uses a secure upload tool. There's a link here. There's also a link in your RFP instructions. If you've never used the upload tool before, I would recommend going in and just setting up and trying it out. You can send a test. Meredith is the one that gets it, so it's real personal. She's on the other end. And you can just say, Meredith, I'm sending a test to this to make sure that I have it down, so when I go to submit my application materials, that I know that it's working, and so feel free to do that. And then applications are due Monday, March 2nd at 4:30 p.m. So our review process will be, obviously, the applications will have to go through that threshold criteria as I described. And then once they make it through that process, they'll be scored by staff and community reviewers. The community reviewer piece is really important to Minnesota Housing. We incorporated community reviewers over the last couple of processes for Homework Starts with Home and then for some of our other grants in our department, and it's worked really well. We try as much as possible to include people with lived experience, and so I think the most important piece to that is your application writing needs to be really clear and readable, because there may be some folks who are reviewing your application who are not familiar with your organization or your community, and so as you're thinking about the writing of that narrative, just try to think about what would you tell your neighbor, not just what would you tell the state staff that's already familiar with the program. And then after the scoring takes place, we'll have a review meeting, and that's where we do a lot of thoughtful discussion about each application. And based on the discussion at the review meeting, we may have some additional questions for you, or we may have some even prior to that when people are doing their own individual reviews. And so don't be surprised if we reach out to you to ask for clarification about certain types of things that you've written in your application. And then after our review meeting, we make a final award determination, and we think about the geographic consideration as well. So some of our programs have a split between the metro and the greater Minnesota area in a percentage. In this circumstance, we're simply looking at making sure that our resources have been deployed both in greater Minnesota and in the metro. We don't have necessarily set percentages, but we really want to make sure we're thoughtful about that. And then we will ask our leadership for approval at that point, and then our board for approval. And so after that, you'll receive letters on whether or not you've been awarded funds, and that will happen relatively quickly after the meeting, probably the next day. And so our timeline is that applications are due March 2nd. We will go to board May 21st, and likely by Friday, which is the following day, you will have been notified of the selection of those applications. And then we will plan due diligence training. So there's a whole process that happens once you're awarded funds through Minnesota Housing. You have to submit some additional items, and that takes up to 2 months. And so just be prepared to set aside some time for that if you are awarded funding. Typically, we often aren't able to award everything that people have asked for, so there's some adjustments that are made to your application with the budget and with your work plan, and we'll need to be notified about what that's going to look like as a result of the funding that we award. And we always ask people to stay within the spirit of the application that they've submitted, so hopefully you won't be submitting something different to us after we have given you your award, but we just want to have more detail about what you're adjusting. And then we'll fully execute the grant contracts by August 1st, and hopefully all of you will be off the ground at that point. So just kind of think about looking at that due diligence list. It is available in the instructions, kind of tells you a little bit about what you'll be asked for if you're awarded funds, and so that'll be helpful to you to sort of think about preparing to have those materials ready. And then by Saturday, July 31st of 2021, all of the activities will be completed for planning, and for the actual program grant, it will be September 30th, 2023. And this is a little bit intentional as well, because we will be issuing out our next round of Homework Starts with Home funding in the fall of 2021. And so it's likely that sometime in that planning period, we'll be issuing out an RFP, probably in the spring of 2021. And then those applications will be due and we will be starting to issue funding for round 3 of Homework Starts with Home. And then we'll issue round 4 of Homework Starts with Home by 2023. And both of those start dates will be October 1st. But just letting you know that, sort of for the next, or as this round completes, there will be another round that will be issued in the interim, and then another one in 2023. All right, so for July 17th, the due diligence items that you need are listed here. And I'm not going to get into the detail now because you don't need it, especially if you're not awarded funds, but you can certainly look at that. You could ask us questions about it if it's something you want to prepare for ahead of time. If you are somebody who's new to getting state funding, you will have to fill out an authorization form for the electronic funds transfer. So that'll be something new that you'll have to do if you are a new grantee with us. And now, almost made it, but yeah. So we still have some time for questions. But we also have the format online that people can ask us questions in. I'm going to go down and, because I know someone left instructions. I guess my computer's not working. I'll let you read the notes. Do you want to read the notes for the question? Well, and make sure that people know how to submit them. Unfortunately, my screen is frozen, so I can't read my notes.
If you can send them in via the chat function or send in questions, you can also raise your hand to ask your questions. And a few have come in already, so I'll start with those while people are sending them in. One person asked.
And just speak really loud, and just in case.
One person is asking regarding eligibility and population served. What about being year 1 in permanent supportive housing but having experienced long-term or chronic homelessness before entry? Would they be eligible for service?
Would they be eligible? Can you, maybe I missed a technical detail on that.
Sure. Someone has been in permanent supportive housing for 1 year but experienced long-term or chronic homelessness before entry. Would they fall in the definition of homelessness that you described as being qualification?
If they're in permanent supportive housing, they're housed. So I don't, so there could be a situation where somebody is at risk of losing their housing that may make them eligible. But in general, anybody that's housed would not be eligible.
And I'm assuming if it's permanent supportive, they would be receiving services as well.
Thank you. Other questions, Mary?
Another one, across the state, according to ICA and HMIS data, the waiting period between assessment and housing through coordinated entry is over a year. Can we do this work outside of coordinated entry?
So I would just refer you to the application instructions around the selection process that you need to define in your application. There are significant regional differences in the way that coordinated entry is structured, which means that there isn't a single answer statewide for how the interface between this program and coordinated entry works. In general, where coordinated entry exists and operates, it should be the process for determining prioritization of which families are referred. There may be important inputs to that process from schools or other partners that are helping to make sure that individuals are being identified and prioritized by that system appropriately. And in addition, some coordinated entry systems do not currently consider anybody that's at risk, only individuals that are currently experiencing homelessness on the narrower HUD definition. So again, where there's a difference between the scope of Homework Starts with Home and your coordinated entry system, that's where you have to define how that process would work, with the expectation being that you start with that coordinated entry process.
And this is where, we did try to build in some extra time for this grant application and the due date being in March, but it's a great time to connect with your school and with your continuum of care priority wait list manager in order to see what the intersection is for those households who are on the list and the schools that you are looking to provide services in, because there may already be families that you can identify, and also make sure that the school liaisons are referring those households that they're identifying who are homeless to the coordinated entry system, so that you're not dealing with folks that aren't in the system already, and you're not having to worry about being able to figure out which households you can pull off of that priority list. So I think any of that pre-work that you can do will really help.
And I'll just lift up one specific example. From round one of Homework Starts with Home, one applicant actually ended up changing the priority list management process so that it included which schools the kids that were on the priority list attended, to be able to make referrals that were really specifically to schools that were connected to Homework Starts with Home. And so I think there are some innovative ways that you can figure out how to make sure that the highest priority families to serve in your community are being connected with the program. And certainly we hope that this helps move some folks off of the coordinated entry priority list. That's what we hope the additional capacity can help to achieve. Other questions?
Is there more on there? Yeah.
Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I just wonder, is the list of schools available now to us?
So, that's really for your local application to determine which schools you would want to partner with.
Exactly.
There is a list of how many homeless students each school in the state has identified that's available on the MDE data center online. There are two ways you can go at it. You can go into the data center and look for reports, and there's a student enrollment report that breaks it down by school or school district or county, and then statewide. Another way that you can do it is using the interactive MDE report card, where you can actually enter the name of a candidate school, and in the tab that describes who are the students, I believe is the title for the tab, that'll actually give you information about how many homeless students attended that specific school or district, whatever you enter into the search.
So didn't you say that the school district has to be like approved, or I don't remember the language you used?
They have to be a partner.
Yeah,
with
exactly.
you, but you would be approaching those schools.
There isn't a predefined list of schools that you can.
So there's not an opt-in from school districts already that are interested in partnering on this program?
Correct.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Another question is from a nonprofit housing provider. Do you have to be a housing trust fund or FHPAP provider now or in the future to do a planning grant?
You do not have to be an administrator of housing trust fund or FHPAP to apply for the planning grant. You will have to be or have that partner available to be the lead applicant on your application once you apply for a program grant. But for the planning grant, you do not. We recognize that some of the champions of this work may come from an entity that's not a current housing trust fund or FHPAP administrator, and that is very deliberate on our part to leave that open as far as eligible applicants for that grant.
What is the largest program grant possible?
We've not defined an upper limit.
Is there a lower limit?
We have not defined a lower limit. We have not defined a limit, except 5,000 for planning. That's the only limit.
Got it.
And the total amount that we have available. That's the real limit.
Will this PowerPoint be available after today's webinar?
Yes, it will be available on our website for Minnesota Housing.
These are great questions.
Yeah.
Any others?
Would court fees be ineligible direct assistance costs when a household is going through eviction?
As long as rectifying the court fees will get the household into housing, so like you have a landlord who's wanting to house this individual, but they want to see the prior debt paid off, for example, that would be eligible under the Family Homeless Prevention Assistance Program. It would not be eligible necessarily under Housing Trust Fund, so I would use your Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Funds for that.
And can current grantees request additional funds for expanded services?
Yes, current Homework Starts with Home grant administrators are eligible to apply for funding.
I don't want to keep asking, but was it, how oversubscribed was the program during the first round?
It depended on the funding source. We had two of our funding sources that we had 8 times as many applications as we had dollars.
So it's competitive, yeah,
yes.
okay.
Yeah, we had 14 applicants the first round, and we awarded 5.
Okay,
And we initially started out with $2 million in resources, but it went up to 4.15.
okay.
One more did come through, can the rental assistance be combined with housing vouchers?
Not sure I understand exactly what that would mean or how that would work. It's a little hard to answer in the abstract. If the housing voucher is already making the rent affordable at a 30% of income basis, for example, it's hard to see what additional support would be needed from the rental assistance. But if there were a specific situation, we could certainly explore that. It's a little hard in that very high level description to say.
Every once in a great while, we do have a household in crisis with a voucher, where there's an emergency, they spend their portion that is supposed to go to rent on something else, and they utilize FHPAP funds to resolve the one-time crisis. But it's not necessarily the household that we're looking to serve with Homework Starts with Home, because in most cases, we're trying to stabilize those households in housing that aren't currently in housing. But we can certainly look at each scenario as they come up, and you're welcome, if you are awarded funds. One of the things that we do on a regular basis is traverse all of these intricate crises that happen, and people reach out to us directly, and then we try to help you resolve those.
Any other questions?
To confirm, it looks like it was K through 12 in the past, wasn't the focus more on elementary age? Does that change?
So there was a population priority previously focused on students that were grade 5 and younger. And so what you see in the application are kind of the amended or revised Homework Starts with Home population priorities.
So it is K-12 now, no.
I want to clarify that it's pre-K.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
4 to 5-year-olds would likely be eligible.
Any other questions? These are great.
Not yet.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
And we will have another session, another frequently asked questions session, just for questions, and that'll happen in January, the 14th of January. And then we'll also be collecting questions as people contact us, and then we'll issue out answers and make sure that those are published on our website.
One more question just came through
Great.
about the timeline. She writes, if I'm figuring this correctly, it looks like the grant term and the budget would be for 38 months. Question mark.
That probably makes sense. If your start date is August 1st of 2020, yes, and you'll go through September of 2023. Yes, that's correct. So it's slightly longer than our last grant term, and that is just an intentional way of trying to line up the budget with the next timeline of the Homework Starts with Home application round.
Planning grants are only for 12 months, just to emphasize that point too. Any other questions? Well, we hope this was helpful, and appreciate your interest in this opportunity, and more importantly, your interest in ending student homelessness. So, team go, thanks everybody.
Thanks, one quick question.
One last question.
On the, so planning grant, say there are 2 of you that were gonna collaborate, can you each go in for a $40,000 planning grant?
I think the question would be whether, if you're referencing each other's work in
Right.
grants, I think it would be hard for us to see that as 2 separate grants, because we'd have to make a decision on both of them or neither of them.
Got it.
So
Better to go in together for a.
yeah, so I think if you were adjacent, right, if the activities that you were doing, the partners you were doing, the geography you were doing, any of those things ended up being distinct, we could see them very clearly as
Even if you end up
one could move forward.
Okay.
But it's a little harder when both of them would be intertwined to think of them as separate grants.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for being here.
Good.